Good morning. When I hear that theme, I think ESPN or WWF. I don't know if I'll be nearly as entertaining as the WWF with you this morning, but Mr. Chairman, thank you for the very kind introduction. My fellow panel members, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to also acknowledge Jennifer Hart from the Canadian High Commission here in Colombo. It's nice to see a fellow Canadian here in Sri Lanka. And I also want to begin by thanking the Sri Lanka Army for organizing this event and for being so gracious in flying me here from Ottawa. It wasn't an easy way to get here. They've been amazing hosts, and I'm not used to being treated as a VIP, and I have to say I really like it. And when I return home this week, I'm going to tell my wife that this is now the new normal, and I will see how that goes. Probably not very well. But I want to share with you a perspective that is not normally shared in an open venue like this. And I want to pick up on some of Admiral Fallon's comments. I worked in intelligence for more than 3 decades. So my perspective on violent extremism and terrorism is informed by those 30 years as an intelligence analyst. I'm not an academic, not that there's anything wrong with that, but my job as an employee of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service was to detect individuals radicalizing to violence who intended to act on that radicalization to violence and kill people or leave the country to join terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or Daesh or Al-Shabaab. These are where my remarks are going to come from. And I agree with the Admiral that as intelligence services, we don't do a really great job of participating in the dialogue. And I think we need to. We certainly have to be very careful in what we say. We don't want it to disrupt ongoing investigations. But there's a lot we can say. And there's a perspective we can share. And I hope to do that with you this morning. I retired from the Canadian intelligence community about 2 years ago. And I've made it my mission, if I can use that term, to talk to ordinary people and extraordinary people as yourselves about terrorism. So I have been given the extremely simple task of defining what we're talking about. And we've heard from other speakers already this morning, and there's been lots of different attempts to do this. I want to simplify it even more. When it comes to violent radicalization, and let's remember, we're talking violent radicalization. Radicalization's not a problem. In fact, some of the greatest progresses in international history came from radical people. So being a radical is not a problem. When you take that radicalism and try to impose it via violent means, then it becomes a problem. But I want to distill violent radicalization and terrorism to 3 very, very simple phrases. Number 1, something is wrong. Number 2, I know who's behind it. And number 3, I have to use violence to make it right. That's the essence of terrorism. Somebody or some group of people thinks they have a grievance, they think there's an injustice, they think they've been done wrong, and they know who's responsible, or they think they know who's responsible. This state, or that state, or this organization, or those people. And the most important thing, and while we're here today, the only way for me to get justice, the only way for me to amend these wrongs, to right these wrongs, is to use violence. That's as simple as I can put the problem before us. Now, when it comes to radicalization to violence, the problem is both very simple and very difficult. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about root causes, which I've been asked to talk about. I hate the term root causes. I really detest the term root causes because it's too simplistic. And lots of things have been proposed by lots of very bright people in the last 30, 40 years about what causes radicalization to violence. And from my perspective, having worked actual investigations, having seen people go down these various pathways, you realize pretty quickly that each element, each cause, each driving force that's proposed is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause terrorism, to cause violence. Now, in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about 3 of them. But you've seen the list. It's all about poverty. It's all about lack of education. It's all about lack of opportunity. The 3 I want to focus on this morning, a lot of people say that terrorism and violent radicalization stem from mental illness. That if you're going to be a terrorist, you must be psychologically unbalanced. Now, I can cite you Canadian statistics here. I have no idea what happens here in Sri Lanka or in your home countries. But Canadian authorities estimate that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 Canadians suffers from a mental illness. So if mental illness were a serious driving factor for radicalization to violence, my former organization would be in deep, deep trouble. Because that means we have to worry about between 5 and 7 million Canadians who might radicalize to violence. And clearly we don't have 5 to 7 million Canadians who radicalize to violence. And yet we hear it all the time. He must be schizophrenic. He must be mentally ill. I'm not saying that there's no incidence of mental illness. There is. But it is not, by far, it is not the majority of cases, based on what we know. The second one, and picking up on the Admiral's comments about, unstable places, ungoverned spaces, failing states, failed states. And I certainly agree with them that failed states and failing states represent a huge challenge for us on many levels, not just violent extremism and terrorism. But even there, we see terrorism that comes out of states that have nothing to do with failure. I left Canada 3 days ago. And unless a lot of bad things have happened in the past 72 hours, my country is prosperous, it is successful, it is the envy of many people in the world, and yet we produce violent extremists. We have terrorists, we've had terrorist plots. We've had Canadians join Daesh, we've had Canadians join Al-Qaeda, we've had Canadians join Al-Shabaab. So again, wherever we place failing states, and that's an important issue we have to address, it doesn't actually solve the problem. And the last one I want to talk about has a very important Sri Lankan connection. So a couple of years ago, an American scholar named Ariel Krigolansky and a Canadian, Jocelyn Bélanger, did a study here in Sri Lanka about reintegrating former terrorists with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. And from what I've seen, I've spoken with both gentlemen, a fairly successful program. But what worries me is that out of this study, one of the driving factors for why these men decided to become terrorists, and this is important, they decided to become terrorists. Let's get rid of this brainwashing stuff, okay? Becoming a violent extremist is a decision, and it's a rational one from your perspective. The cause that they put forward as the important one for these young men in northern Sri Lanka was a search for significance. They saw joining the LTTE as a culmination of their search for significance. I have a problem with this. Hands up, anybody in the room who doesn't want to be significant, who doesn't want to try and find meaning in life, who doesn't want to try and be somebody. We all have that. As humans, we all have that desire. Which would mean, by implication, that every single person in this room, including me, could potentially be a terrorist, given the right conditions. And that's my point. There is no magic formula for why someone radicalizes to violence. The best way I can define this is it depends. So whatever factor you want to put forward as an important driving factor to violent radicalization, once you start looking at the data, once you start examining cases, you soon realize that what you've proposed is inadequate. Because the one thing we learned when I worked for the security service for all those years is that each person's individual process to violent radicalization is individual. There is no template, there is no paradigm, there's no nice chart, there's no Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't work that way. You have to examine each case on its own merits. And this is why I get very worried when I read about proposals that we're going to map out radicalization to violence in Central Asia or in North America or in Europe. Because you have to take into account national differences, subnational differences, local differences, and individual differences. And if we don't do that, if we try to overgeneralize this problem, we end up with bad policies and bad programs that will not address the issue. All these things that people talk about, poverty, ungoverned spaces, mental illness, lack of opportunity, they are all very important issues. And in a perfect world, we would resolve all of them. And yet, if we resolved all those issues magically tomorrow, someone waves a wand and all of a sudden there's no more poverty, no more sense of alienation, no more sense of disenfranchisement, no sense of isolation, you would not eliminate violent extremism. It would help. There's no question, this is a good thing to do. But let's not confuse what we think to be the causes of other social ills with the causes of violent extremism. And let us not confuse, which everybody does, the very important distinction between correlation and causation. Just because a poor person radicalizes to violence does not mean that was the cause of that radicalization to violence. Any more than if a millionaire decides to radicalize to violence, it's because he's a millionaire. Does that make any sense to anyone in this room? I hope not. So I think when we look at the problem of radicalization to violence, and we look at trying to understand it better, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. It is highly unlikely, and I would argue impossible, to come up with some kind of a generalizable, universal template or framework into which you can cram all these individual cases. There's just too much variability when it comes to radicalization to violence. I saw that in Canada over my 15 years with the security service. Every single case was different. Yes, we had people that were born into very low socioeconomic conditions. And yes, we had PhD students, and we had people making good salaries. And yes, we had people who failed in relationships, and we had people who were married with children. So my advice to all of you here is to recognize that we're talking about an extremely different, variegated, variable problem. And I know there's a desire to come up with a simplistic solution. That's what humans like, simplistic solutions. Give it to me in black and white. Unfortunately, life's not like that. Life is multiple shades of gray. I was going to say 50 shades of gray, but that takes us into a completely different talk. So let's be genuine in our understanding of the phenomenon. The other two things, I have very little time remaining, that I want to raise as well, that are two other aspects of this problem that really worry me, is this notion of self-radicalization. It gets used a lot. So-and-so self-radicalized. In all of my years at work, I came across precisely 0 cases of self-radicalization. Radicalization is a human-to-human process because we are social animals. We talk to people, whether it's in our lives, online, it doesn't matter. I would submit to you, with very few exceptions, that nobody self-radicalizes. You have to get input from somebody else. You have questions, you have doubts, you have concerns, and those doubts and those questions and those concerns get solved for you by somebody, your father, your brother, your cousin, the guy you go to a mosque or to a synagogue or to a church with, the person you met online. So let's get rid of this notion of self-radicalization. The other one, which is problematic, is lone wolf. I don't like that term either. I prefer a lone actor, and I don't want to get into semantic details, but I think it does matter. Even lone actors don't self-radicalize. They come from more generalizable environments. I want to end with some remarks, some things I learned a couple summers ago. I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and I learned that going to Phoenix in July is a very, very bad time of year to go to Phoenix. It was 47 degrees in Phoenix, and that's Celsius, which is like a bazillion Fahrenheit. And I was in Phoenix at the invitation of the Director of National Intelligence in the United States to take part in what's called we used to be called, I think it's now defunct, the SHARP program, Summer Hard Program. Look at hard problems. And our task was to look at radicalization to violence as a hard problem. And I would love to stand here in front of you and say, all of us, there were 40 or 50 of us, we solved the hard problem. We didn't, because it's still a problem today. We had interesting inputs from intelligence, from law enforcement, from academia, from civil society, but just as the radicalization problem was a hard problem back in 2011, it's a hard problem in 2017, and will be a hard problem in 2027. This is, as the Admiral said, this is not going away, which is not defeatism, it's realism. And I think that collectively we all have a role to collaborate and to cooperate to better understand the problem. Let's put our heads together. Let's put our militaries, our intelligence services, our civil societies, our universities, our think tanks to cooperate in understanding this problem, because none of us is going to solve this on our own, no matter who we are. I'm not sure there is a solution to the problem. There are several solutions that will get to part of it. but it's important to recognize this is a really, really hard problem. So again, thank you for the invitation. I really wish I could stay longer here in Sri Lanka, but as I speak, I have a daughter about to give birth to my first grandson, so I have to get back to Canada sooner rather than later. But thank you for your attention. Much appreciated.